Mother bear tries to enter cabin with her 3 cubs. Man is stunned until what happens next. The storm outside raged with unrelenting fury, blanketing the Alaskan wilderness in a deadly sheet of ice and snow. Mark, a retired ranger, sat by the fire in his modest cabin, his radio crackling with updates of the worst blizzard in decades. Just as he reached for his mug of coffee, a faint scratching sound at the door pierced the howling winds. At first, he dismissed it as branches or debris blown by the storm. But when it grew louder, he stood, heart pounding. Pulling the curtain aside, he froze. There, shivering and frostbitten, was a massive polar bear with 3 cubs clinging to her legs, their eyes pleading. It was an image both surreal and haunting. Mark's instincts told him to stay away. Bears were dangerous. But something in her gaze felt human. The mother bear's fur was patchy, her ribs protruding from beneath her thick coat. She pawed gently at the door, her movements slow and deliberate, as though understanding she was begging for mercy. The cubs huddled closer, their small bodies trembling. Mark's cabin, though sturdy, wasn't equipped for visitors like these. His rifle hung on the wall, a silent reminder of the danger such creatures posed. Yet, his fingers hesitated to reach for it. Mark's mind raced back to his wife, Clara, who had passed years ago. She had a way of seeing beauty in every creature, no matter how fearsome. Even the wildest of animals have a heart, she used to say. He had scoffed at the sentiment then, but now, standing before this desperate mother and her babies, those words resonated. Could he risk everything to let them in? Or would he leave them to the mercy of the storm? The decision weighed heavy. Opening the door to a bear could mean death. Leaving them outside could mean the same, for them. His hand hovered over the latch, the roar of the wind outside competing with the thundering of his heartbeat. The mother bear tilted her head, locking eyes with him as if she understood his dilemma. Her eyes weren't wild with rage or hunger, they were filled with sorrow. Mark took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. Against every instinct of survival, he turned the lock and cracked the door open. What happened next would change his life forever. As the door creaked open, the icy wind burst inside, sending a shiver down Mark's spine. The mother bear stood still, her massive frame blocking most of the blizzard's fury. The cubs peeked from behind her, their eyes wide and unsure. Mark stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Easy now," he whispered, as much to himself as to the bears. The mother bear sniffed the air cautiously, her nose twitching at the scent of warmth and safety. For a moment, Mark regretted his decision. What if she lunged? What if she saw him as a threat? But instead of charging, the bear took one deliberate step forward, her movements slow and calculated. The cubs followed closely, their tiny paws slipping on the icy threshold. Mark retreated further into the room, gripping the back of a chair for balance. His cabin was no sanctuary for wild animals. It was small, cluttered with old furniture, and far too fragile to contain a beast of her size. As the bears entered, the mother's head swiveled, her black eyes scanning the space. She made no sound, her presence dominating the room. The cubs, however, whimpered softly, collapsing in an exhausted heap by the fire. Mark stared at them, his breath hitching. They were barely alive. Their fur, matted with frost and dirt, glistened as the warmth began to melt the ice that clung to their tiny frames. Mark moved cautiously to the corner of the room, grabbing a blanket from a pile of supplies. He tossed it toward the cubs, unsure if they would even know what to do with it. To his astonishment, the mother bear nosed the blanket closer to her babies, wrapping it around them with surprising gentleness. Mark's heart twisted at the sight. She wasn't just a predator, she was a mother, fighting with everything she had to save her young. The storm outside grew fiercer, rattling the windows and shaking the wooden walls. Mark lit another log in the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. He found himself speaking aloud, a habit he'd picked up after Clara passed. "I don't know how you ended up here," he murmured, his voice trembling. "But I'll do what I can." The mother bear turned her head, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, it felt as though they shared an understanding, a fragile truce forged in desperation. But as the fire crackled and the blizzard raged on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this night held secrets far beyond what he could comprehend. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm, the blizzard's roar muffled by thick walls. Mark sat across from the bears, his chair angled to keep them in his line of sight. The mother bear hadn't moved from her position near the cubs, her massive body coiled protectively around them. As she dozed lightly, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath, Mark's mind drifted to memories he had long buried. Years ago, when Clara was still alive, the two had spent their days rehabilitating injured wildlife. Their home had been a refuge for creatures caught in the brutal cycles of nature. Mark could still hear Clara's laugh, her voice soft as she coaxed an injured bird or a frightened fawn into trust. But everything changed the day a rogue bear attacked their sanctuary, leaving Clara fatally wounded. It was a tragedy that hardened Mark, turning his love for animals into a wary tolerance. He hadn't allowed another creature into his life since, until now. Mark's gaze fell on the cubs, now nestled close together in a deep sleep. Their soft snores and occasional twitching reminded him of something Clara had once said: "Even the smallest lives deserve a fighting chance." A pang of guilt hit him. Had he let his grief turn him into someone Clara wouldn't recognize? Perhaps this moment was her way of reminding him who he once was. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the mother bear. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. Mark noticed the deep gash on her side for the first time, hidden beneath her thick fur. It was fresh, the edges jagged and raw. He stood cautiously, fetching his first aid kit from the cabinet. Approaching her felt like stepping into a lion's den, but he couldn't ignore the wound. "Easy, girl," he murmured, kneeling a few feet away. The bear tensed, a low growl rumbling in her throat, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion rather than aggression. Mark held up the antiseptic-soaked cloth, giving her a moment to understand his intentions. Slowly, he reached forward, dabbing at the wound. She flinched but didn't attack. The process was painstaking, and Mark's hands trembled with each movement. As he worked, he noticed scars along her body, evidence of battles she had fought and survived. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he whispered. She blinked, her gaze steady, as if acknowledging his words. When he finished, Mark retreated to his chair, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Inside, the flicker of the fire illuminated an unlikely bond forming between man and beast. But as Mark leaned back, a nagging thought crept into his mind. What had driven this mother bear so far from her natural habitat, risking everything to seek help from a human? Morning crept in slowly, the storm's ferocity waning as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the frost-covered windows. Mark hadn't slept a wink. Instead, he had spent the night watching over his unexpected guests, the weight of their presence a constant reminder of the fragile truce between them. The mother bear's breathing was steadier now, though her exhaustion remained evident. The cubs stirred, their tiny bodies stretching under the blanket, their movements full of the innocence of creatures who didn't yet understand the peril they were in. Mark pulled on his boots and coat, determined to assess the aftermath of the storm. He glanced back at the bears before stepping outside, the icy air biting at his face. The snowdrifts were deep, nearly swallowing his legs as he trudged through them. The landscape, once familiar, now felt alien, trees bent under the weight of ice, and the horizon seemed eerily empty. It wasn't until he reached the edge of the clearing that he noticed something that made his stomach drop: tracks. The massive paw prints weren't surprising, given the bears in his cabin. But these weren't alone. Another set of tracks ran parallel, larger and heavier, with a distinct drag that suggested an injury. Mark crouched, running his gloved fingers over the imprint. Whatever had left these marks was close, and it was no ordinary predator. A low growl echoed through the still air, sending a chill down Mark's spine. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The growl came again, fainter this time, and he realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming from further up the trail. His instincts screamed at him to return to the cabin, but curiosity and a sense of duty pushed him forward. 100 yards ahead, he found the source. A massive male polar bear lay sprawled in the snow, its white coat stained with blood. Its breathing was labored, and one of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle. Mark's heart raced. Polar bears were solitary creatures, but this one seemed connected to the mother and her cubs. Was this her mate? Their protector? The scene painted a grim picture. Perhaps they had fled together, only to be separated by injury and desperation. Mark took a step back, his mind racing. He knew better than to approach a wounded animal of this size, especially one likely to view him as a threat. But leaving it here to die felt cruel. Torn between fear and compassion, he backed away slowly, the bear's eyes tracking his every move. When Mark returned to the cabin, his face was pale. The mother bear greeted him with a soft grunt, her head lifting as if sensing his unease. He stared at her, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Something was wrong in the wilderness, something that had driven these bears to his doorstep. And whatever it was, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Mark paced the cabin, his mind a whirlwind of questions. The injured male bear haunted his thoughts. Why had these animals ventured so far south, far beyond their natural range? What had wounded them? The mother bear watched him with a calm intensity, her cubs now fully awake and nibbling at scraps of food he had set aside. He knew he couldn't keep them here forever, their presence was a temporary miracle, but the wilderness always called its children home. He grabbed his old radio, hoping to reach someone, anyone, for advice. Static greeted him as he adjusted the dial, his frustration mounting. He cursed under his breath, slamming the device on the counter. The isolation was maddening. If the weather hadn't severed communications, maybe he could have warned someone about what he'd seen. The mother bear shifted, her body stiffening. Her ears twitched, and she let out a deep, guttural growl. The cubs froze, huddling closer to her as their small voices joined hers in frightened whimpers. Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned toward the window, scanning the snow-covered expanse outside. At first, he saw nothing. Then, just beyond the tree-line, he caught movement. It was a shadow at first, almost indistinguishable against the stark white landscape. But then it emerged, a figure, humanoid, shrouded in thick furs, carrying a weapon that gleamed in the morning light. Mark's stomach dropped. Hunters. The figure was joined by another, then a third. They moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, scanning the ground for tracks. Mark quickly realized their focus wasn't him, it was the bears. Panic surged through him. He didn't know who these men were, but their intent was unmistakable. Polar bears were endangered, their hunting strictly prohibited. These men weren't just poachers, they were criminals willing to kill anything for profit. Mark grabbed his rifle, not to shoot but to intimidate. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting through his jacket. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the stillness. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward him. He raised the rifle slightly, just enough to show he meant business. "This is private property. Get the hell out of here." For a moment, silence reigned. Then one of the men took a step forward, lowering his hood to reveal a weathered face with piercing eyes. "We're tracking something dangerous," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You do well to stay out of it." Mark tightened his grip on the rifle. "There's nothing dangerous here, except me if you don't leave." The man smirked but motioned for the others to retreat. As they disappeared into the trees, Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He turned back toward the cabin, his resolve hardening. These bears weren't just victims of nature, they were targets. And now, so was he. Inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. The mother bear paced nervously, her growls low and constant as if sensing the danger that lingered just beyond the tree line. Mark leaned his rifle against the wall, his hands shaking as he stared out the frosted window. The hunter's retreat had been too easy. He didn't trust them to stay gone. Mark busied himself fortifying the cabin, moving furniture against the doors and windows to create makeshift barricades. He couldn't shake the image of the injured male bear lying defenseless in the snow. If the hunters found it, they'd have no trouble tracking the mother and her cubs to his doorstep. Mark didn't know how far he was willing to go to protect these animals, but he couldn't abandon them now, not after everything they'd endured. Hours passed, and the silence outside became oppressive. The snow had stopped falling, and the world felt too still, like the calm before a storm. Mark checked his rifle again, ensuring it was loaded. His gaze fell on the mother bear, who had settled near the fire with her cubs. She watched him closely, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and trust. It was a bond neither of them had intended, but one that now tied their fates together. As night fell, the first sound came, a distant crack of a branch. Mark froze, his ears straining. The sound was followed by another, closer this time. His heart raced. The hunters were back, and they weren't being subtle anymore. Mark extinguished the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. He motioned for the bears to stay quiet, though he knew they wouldn't understand. The first gunshot shattered the silence, the bullet striking the wooden frame of the cabin. Mark ducked, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "They're trying to scare us out," he muttered to himself, gripping his rifle. A second shot rang out, this one closer to the window. The mother bear let out a roar, her body rising to its full height as she shielded her cubs. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't fight these men alone, not with their firepower and experience. He had an idea, reckless but perhaps their only chance. Mark unlatched the back door, opening it just enough for the bears to escape. He turned to the mother bear, his voice trembling. "Go. Take your cubs and run. I'll hold them off." She hesitated, her eyes locking with his as if understanding his words. Then, with a final grunt, she nudged her cubs toward the door. One by one, they disappeared into the snowy darkness. Mark's hands shook as he braced himself, rifle in hand, and waited. The hunters were closing in, their shadows visible through the windows. He knew he might not survive the night, but he also knew one thing with certainty: he'd bought the bears a chance to live. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in. Mark crouched near the door, his rifle aimed and ready. Outside, the crunch of boots in the snow grew louder. The hunters were circling like wolves, testing his resolve. Through the broken window, Mark caught a glimpse of one. A man with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a grin that made Mark's stomach churn. "Come out," the hunter shouted, his voice sharp and taunting. "We know you've got them in there. Make it easy on yourself." Mark's grip tightened on the rifle. He couldn't afford to let them think the bears were gone. If they believed their prey was still here, they wouldn't waste time tracking the mother and her cubs. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the bullet echoing through the forest. "Leave now," he bellowed, "or you'll regret it." The men paused, their murmurs barely audible over the howling wind. But the brief hesitation didn't last. Another gunshot rang out, splintering the edge of the cabin's doorframe. Mark ducked, his heart racing. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't going to let them win without a fight. As the hunters closed in, Mark's mind raced through his options. The cabin had no back entrance. His only advantage was its small size and familiarity. He could hear one of the men climbing onto the roof, the creak of wood above making his stomach knot. They were trying to force him out, just like they'd done with countless animals before. A sudden roar pierced the night, shaking Mark to his core. It wasn't human, it was the mother bear. She had returned, her massive form emerging from the tree-line like a ghost in the snow. The hunters froze, their attention snapping to the bear. She charged, her roar reverberating through the clearing. Mark seized the moment, firing his rifle at the closest man's feet, forcing him to stumble back. The hunters panicked, their organized attack crumbling. One man fired at the bear, but the bullet grazed her, barely slowing her down. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline as he stepped onto the porch, his rifle aimed at the man on the roof. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice booming. "Now." The hunters, overwhelmed by the combined force of man and beast, began retreating. The mother bear lunged at one, sending him scrambling into the snow. The others followed suit, disappearing into the forest as the mother bear stood her ground, her breath visible in the cold air. When the last of them was gone, Mark lowered his rifle. He stared at the bear, his chest heaving. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his once more. In that moment, he realized she hadn't just returned to fight, she had come back for him. The snow was eerily silent now, the storm's wrath replaced by a quiet stillness that settled over the forest. Mark leaned against the cabin's doorframe, his legs weak with exhaustion. The mother bear stood a few feet away, her massive form backlit by the faint moonlight. Her breathing was heavy, and blood stained her fur where the hunter's bullet had grazed her. Despite her size and ferocity, she seemed fragile in that moment, just a mother protecting her young. Mark's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "You came back." The words felt absurd as they left his mouth, but the weight of their truth hung in the air. The bear didn't respond, of course, but the way she stood, calm and unwavering, felt like an acknowledgement. Mark lowered his gaze, humbled. "Thank you," he whispered. From the tree-line, a faint rustling drew both their attention. Mark tensed, his rifle still in his grip, but it wasn't the hunters returning. It was the cubs. They waddled toward their mother, their tiny frames nearly invisible against the snow. She let out a soft grunt, nudging them closer to her with her nose. Mark watched as they reunited, the sight filling him with a strange mixture of relief and awe. But the moment of peace was fleeting. Mark knew the hunters wouldn't give up so easily. They had been driven away, not defeated, and they'd be back with reinforcements. The bears couldn't stay here, and neither could he. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Mark knelt by the fire, which he rekindled to warm the room one last time. He rummaged through his supplies, pulling out what little food remained and packing it into a sturdy backpack. He knew the terrain well enough to guide the bears to a safer location, an old ranger station miles away that had been abandoned for years. It wasn't ideal, but it was remote, sheltered, and far from prying eyes. The mother bear watched him carefully as he worked, her cubs nestled close to her side. When Mark approached her with a cautious step, holding out a piece of dried fish, she didn't growl or retreat. Instead, she took it gently, her dark eyes meeting his. It was a quiet understanding between two beings who had been forced into each other's lives by forces beyond their control. As dawn began to break, Mark stood at the edge of the clearing, the mother bear and her cubs behind him. He looked back at his cabin one last time, knowing it would no longer be his sanctuary. Turning to the bears, he tightened his grip on his rifle and started walking. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're not safe here anymore." The bears followed, their steps slow but deliberate. Together, man and beast disappeared into the snow-covered wilderness, the cabin shrinking into the distance. Mark didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: survival was no longer just his fight. The journey was grueling, the snow deep and unrelenting. Mark led the way, his boots crunching through the icy crust as he glanced back every few steps to ensure the bears followed. The cubs struggled to keep up, their small bodies sinking into the snow with each step, but their mother nudged them forward, her strength seemingly boundless despite her injuries. The sight only deepened Mark's resolve to see them to safety. The ranger station was miles away, tucked into a forested valley that offered both shelter and seclusion. Mark hadn't visited it in years, but he remembered its location clearly. It was one of the places he and Clara had once used for wildlife rehabilitation. As he trudged forward, memories of those days filled his mind. Clara would have loved these bears, he thought. She would have fought for them without hesitation, without fear. By midday, they reached a frozen river, its surface shimmering under the pale sunlight. Mark hesitated. Crossing would be risky, the ice looked thick, but he couldn't be sure of its stability. He tested the surface with the butt of his rifle, listening for cracks. "Careful," he muttered as if the bears could understand. The mother bear stepped forward, her weight causing the ice to groan. Mark held his breath, but she crossed steadily, her cubs following in her footsteps. Halfway across, a deep crack echoed through the air. Mark spun around just in time to see one of the cubs fall through the ice, its tiny body vanishing into the freezing water. The mother bear let out a deafening roar, her massive paws clawing at the ice as she tried to reach her cub. Mark didn't think. He dropped his rifle and ran to the edge of the hole, plunging his arm into the icy water. His fingers found fur, and with a desperate pull, he dragged the cub out. The cub shivered violently, its tiny body soaked and cold. Mark quickly shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around the trembling creature. The mother bear watched him closely, her growls softening as she nudged the cub with her nose, checking for injuries. Mark's teeth chattered as he stood, his body numb from the freezing water. "You're okay now," he said quietly, his words meant for both the cub and himself. As they continued, the sun dipped lower and the temperature plummeted. The ranger station finally came into view, its wooden structure partially obscured by snowdrifts. Relief washed over Mark as he led the bears to the entrance. The door creaked open, revealing a space that, though dusty and abandoned, was sturdy and intact. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Mark built a fire in the old stone hearth, its warmth chasing away the bitter cold. The mother bear settled near the flames, her cubs curling up beside her. Mark sat across from them, his body exhausted but his mind racing. The hunters wouldn't stop, they'd come for the bears, and possibly for him. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. As he stared into the flickering flames, an idea began to form, a way to protect the bears and ensure the hunters never found them again. But it would require him to risk everything, including his life. The night was long, the wind howling through the trees outside the ranger station. Mark sat by the fire, the flames casting eerie shadows against the walls. The bears, exhausted from the journey, had fallen into a deep sleep, the mother bear's breathing steady and calm as she nestled her cubs close. The crackling fire provided the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin, but Mark's mind refused to quiet. His idea had come to him in fragments, like a puzzle he wasn't sure he could solve. To keep the bears safe, he would need to lead the hunters off their trail, to misdirect them long enough for the bears to vanish into the wilderness, far from anyone who might try to harm them. But there was a cost. It wasn't a plan that left room for mistakes. It would require deception, sacrifice, and perhaps even the ultimate risk, his own life. He glanced at the bears once more, the mother's eyes flickering open to meet his gaze. For a moment, it was as if they shared an understanding, as though she knew what he was contemplating. Mark swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. He couldn't leave them to face the hunters alone. He had made a promise, to Clara, to himself, that he would protect these creatures, just as he had promised to protect her all those years ago. But the stakes were higher now, and there was no turning back. The idea was dangerous. Mark would have to use himself as bait, draw the hunters away from the bears and lead them on a false trail. He could disappear into the wilderness, maybe even circle back to his cabin, where the hunters would waste their time looking for him. But it would require him to stay ahead of them, always just out of reach, never allowing them to find the true path. And once they left, the bears would be free to go on. He exhaled slowly, gathering his resolve. There was no other choice. His life, his safety, was secondary now. It was the bears' survival that mattered most. He rose from his seat, his body stiff and aching. The fire flickered weakly, but he couldn't afford to rest. Mark gathered his gear, preparing for what would likely be his last journey, through the cold, through the wilderness, with nothing but the hope that his plan would succeed. The mother bear stirred, her nose twitching as if sensing his movements. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering, and in that instant, Mark understood. She wasn't just trusting him to protect her cubs, she had placed her faith in him, a bond forged in mutual survival. The weight of that trust made his heart heavy, but also filled him with an unspoken determination. Mark took one last look at the bears, now awake and watching him with quiet curiosity. He stepped toward the door, his hand on the handle, ready to face whatever would come next. "Stay safe," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll make sure they don't find you." With a final glance over his shoulder, Mark stepped out into the cold night, disappearing into the snow-covered wilderness. He knew the hunters wouldn't stop until they had their prize, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that the mother and her cubs would live to see another day. As he vanished into the darkness, the fire in the ranger station flickered out, and the snow began to fall once again, covering his footprints and the story he would never tell.